Okay, so you want to own a cruise ship. Picture it, your name on the hull. Thousands of guests pay you every single day for food they already paid for a room they will sleep in for exactly 1 week, then leave. No landlord problem. No empty units. A floating hotel that never has a vacancy because it moves to wherever the guests already want to be. Now walk around to the back of that ship. Look up at the flag. It's not American. It's Panamanian, or Liberian, or the flag of a country you couldn't point to on a map, the Marshall Islands. Carnival Corporation is headquartered in Miami, Florida. It is legally incorporated in Panama. Royal Caribbean Group runs its ships out of Miami too. Legally, it's a Liberian company. Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings is domiciled in Bermuda. Three of the largest tourism companies on Earth, selling almost entirely to American and European vacationers, and not one of them is, on paper, American. That's not an accident. That's the entire business model. And it starts with a 99-year-old loophole in the U.S. tax code that most passengers walking up the gangway have never heard of. In early 2025, a U.S. commerce official said out loud, on live television, what the industry usually keeps quiet, that cruise ships flying foreign flags pay essentially nothing in American tax, and that this was going to end. Within a single day of those comments airing, cruise line stocks lost a combined $9 billion in market value. $9 billion, wiped off 3 balance sheets, because someone in Washington said the loophole's name out loud. That's how much the entire industry's valuation depends on nobody closing it. Here's the illusion first. From the dock, a cruise line looks like an airline with swimming pools. You buy a ticket, you board. The company that sold you the ticket owns the ship, employs the crew, pays taxes like any other business headquartered in Miami or Southampton, the same way United Airlines pays taxes in the United States. None of that is true. The reality starts with something called a flag of convenience. Under international maritime law, a ship doesn't have to be registered in the country where its owner lives, or where its head office sits, or where most of its passengers come from. It has to be registered somewhere. In a handful of countries, Panama, Liberia, the Bahamas, Marshall Islands, Malta, will register almost any ship, ask very few questions, and charge a modest annual fee for the privilege. The practice dates back to the 1920s, when American shipowners registered vessels in Panama specifically to serve alcohol to passengers during Prohibition. Prohibition ended in 1933. The registrations never went back. By 1968, Liberia, a country that, at the time, had barely any coastline infrastructure to speak of, had overtaken the United Kingdom to become the largest ship registry on Earth. Not because Liberian shipping expertise was in demand. Because Liberian paperwork was cheap, and Liberian labor law asked almost nothing of the shipowner. Here's the twist inside the twist. The Liberian registry, the one flying over Royal Caribbean's entire fleet, isn't actually run out of Liberia. It's administered day-to-day by a private company called LISCR, headquartered in Dulles, Virginia, just outside Washington, D.C., and owned by U.S. nationals. So a Royal Caribbean ship, based in Miami, selling vacations to Americans, flies a Liberian flag whose paperwork is processed by a Virginia office an hour from the U.S. Capitol. The loophole isn't hiding overseas. Large parts of its plumbing sit inside the United States, just structured so that none of the tax obligations follow the paperwork home. This is the part where the illusion cracks, because a flag of convenience isn't just a tax address. It's a complete operating system. The country whose flag you fly sets your safety inspection regime. It sets your minimum crew wage, if it sets one at all. It decides which labor unions, if any, get legal access to your ship. And under U.S. tax law specifically, it decides whether your company owes the American government a single dollar on the money it earns from American passengers. That last part has a name. Section 883 of the U.S. Internal Revenue Code. It exempts a foreign corporation from U.S. federal income tax on income earned from operating ships internationally, as long as that corporation is organized in a country that offers the same courtesy back to American shipping companies. Panama, Liberia, the Bahamas, Marshall Islands. All of them qualify. And as we're about to see, this single tax provision doesn't just save cruise lines money. It restructures the entire industry. Who gets hired, who gets paid, and who gets left behind when something goes wrong. There's a second, quieter piece of U.S. law working alongside Section 883, and it's worth naming here because it explains something passengers rarely question. Why so many American cruises out of Miami or Los Angeles mysteriously stop in Ensenada, Mexico, or Victoria, Canada, for a few hours before coming home. That's the Passenger Vessel Services Act. It bars foreign-flagged ships, which, as we've just established, is almost the entire industry, from carrying passengers directly between two U.S. ports without a foreign port in between. So the itinerary you booked as a straightforward Alaska or California cruise is, legally, a workaround, a brief detour into another country's waters, built entirely to satisfy a 19th-century cabotage law written for cargo ships, not swimming pools. So let's say you actually want to build one of these ships and put it to work. The first number you need is the price of the hull itself. Royal Caribbean's newest ship, Icon of the Seas, cost roughly $2 billion to build. Not $200 million. $2 billion for one ship before it has carried a single paying guest. That is the entry price of the industry, and it eliminates almost everyone before the conversation even starts. You are not competing with local hotel operators. You are competing with three publicly traded conglomerates who can finance a $2 billion asset through capital markets that trust their balance sheets. And those three conglomerates are not building one ship at a time. As of the end of 2024, the global order book stood at roughly 50 new cruise ships under construction, representing an estimated 116,500 additional berths scheduled to enter service by 2028. That is a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar pipeline, financed years in advance, built on the assumption that the tax and labor structure underneath the entire industry keeps working exactly the way it has for the past century. Change that structure, and you don't just change one company's margin. You change the collateral behind 50 ships that are already under construction. Assume you clear that hurdle. Now the layers of costs start stacking, one on top of the next, each one a small twist you didn't budget for. Layer 1. Registry and flagging fees, paid annually to whichever open registry you choose, modest on their own, but married to a second, much larger obligation. To keep that flag, and to keep insurers willing to cover your ship, you need to pass safety inspections under the International Maritime Organization's SALAS Convention, Safety of Life at Sea. That means fire suppression systems, lifeboat capacity for every soul on board, structural stability standards, and periodic dry dock inspections that can cost millions of dollars and take the ship out of revenue service for weeks. Layer 2. Crewing. And this is where the flag of convenience system does its real work. Because your flag state, not the country where your passengers live, sets the labor rules on board. The Maritime Labor Convention, the closest thing seafarers have to a global bill of rights, sets an upper limit of 14 hours of work per day and 72 hours per week. Read that number again. 72 hours a week is the ceiling, not the violation. Crew contracts routinely run 6 to 10 months at a time, 7 days a week, with no day fully off until the contract ends. And the wages sitting underneath those hours vary enormously by department and by flag. Housekeeping and food service crew, drawn overwhelmingly from the Philippines, Indonesia, India, and Eastern Europe, have historically been reported earning base wages low enough that, before tips, they sit well under what the same hours would command on shore in the countries selling the tickets. Turnover follows naturally from that math. According to figures compiled by the International Transport Workers Federation, the average length of time a cruise employee stayed aboard fell from roughly 5 years in 1970 to about 9 months by 2000. And recruiting agents in some source countries have been documented charging prospective crew $1,500 to $2,000 just to secure a job offer, a fee that is technically forbidden under international maritime labor rules, but one that leaves new hires spending their first months at sea working off a debt before they see a full paycheck of their own. Layer 3. Onboard infrastructure that has nothing to do with sailing the ship and everything to do with extracting revenue once the guest is trapped at sea for a week. Casinos, specialty restaurants, spas, art auctions, shore excursion desks, drink packages. Every one of these is a separate build cost, a separate licensing headache, a separate profit center you have to design in before the keel is even laid. One side of this equation, the sticker price of a cabin, which is often priced low enough to look like a bargain compared to a week at a beach resort. The other side, everything that sticker price does not include, layered on after you've already committed your credit card and canceled your other vacation plans. Layer 4, and this one is almost invisible from the deck: fuel and insurance, both priced in a global market that has nothing to do with your itinerary. A single large cruise ship can burn well over 150 tons of fuel a day. Marine insurance for a vessel worth over $1 billion, carrying thousands of lives, is its own specialized underwriting market. And every dollar of premium is fixed before a single ticket goes on sale, meaning the fare has to cover it regardless of how full the ship actually sails. By the time you've built the ship, flagged it, crewed it under the loosest labor regime you can legally use, and fitted it with enough onboard revenue infrastructure to make the low ticket price worthwhile, you haven't built a hotel. You've built a floating jurisdiction, one that answers to almost nobody in the country where most of its money comes from. Now here's where the real business model reveals itself, and it isn't the ticket. For decades, the cruise industry sold itself on the fare, one price, all-inclusive, everything covered. That was never really true, and today it's true less than ever. In the second quarter of 2024, Royal Caribbean's gross onboard spending averaged $92.44 per passenger per day. Norwegian Cruise Line holdings averaged $126.85 per passenger per day. Carnival averaged $83.41 per day, not per cruise. Across a full year in 2025, onboard spending, casinos, bars, specialty dining, shore excursions, spa treatments, Wi-Fi packages, photo packages, art auctions, made up 30.2% of Royal Caribbean's total revenue and 34% of Carnival's. That's not a side hustle bolted onto a ticket business. That's a third of the entire company, running on discretionary spending from guests who already paid to get on the boat, and, once they're 1,000 miles from land, have nowhere else to spend their money. The ticket gets you through the door. Everything after that door is the actual profit engine, and part of that engine is quietly funded by the passengers themselves, in a way most of them never fully register. As of 2025, Royal Caribbean automatically charges $18.50 per person per day for guests in standard cabins, $21 per day for suites, as a gratuity, pooled and distributed to dining, bar, and stateroom crew. Carnival charges $16 to $18 a day, depending on cabin category. On a standard 7-night cruise, that's roughly $130 to $150 per passenger, collected automatically. That functions less like a tip and more like a mandatory service fee. One that effectively shifts a meaningful share of the cruise-based compensation off the company's payroll and onto the passenger's final bill, itemized separately from the fare that got them to click book. And notice what this does to the incentive structure. A hotel on land competes with the hotel down the street. Cheaper room service pulls guests elsewhere. A cruise ship doesn't have that problem for 7 straight days. Once you're on board, the ship is the market. There is no competing casino 2 blocks away. There is no cheaper dinner option outside the front door. The captive audience isn't a side effect of the cruise experience. It's the design. Royal Caribbean Group, flagged in Liberia, paid $36.2 million in tax on $10.95 billion in revenue that same year. Norwegian Cruise Line Holdings, flagged in Bermuda, didn't pay tax at all that year. It recorded a tax benefit of $18.86 million on $6.46 billion in revenue. $71 million. That's the number worth sitting with. That is the entire U.S. federal tax bill, for 1 year, for a company that sold over $20 billion of vacations, almost entirely to Americans. And the crew earning that revenue for the company sit on the opposite end of the same structure. Back in 2013, CNN reported on a Royal Caribbean cleaner earning $156.25 a week, with no additional tips, for weeks that ran as long as 84 hours. That's not a minimum wage violation under U.S. law, because U.S. minimum wage law doesn't apply. It's the minimum wage of whatever flag state signed off on the crew contract. More recently, the International Transport Workers Federation, the main global union pushing back against flag of convenience labor practices, reported that in 2025 alone, Its inspectors carried out more than 9,000 inspections across foreign flag vessels in 55 countries and recovered $45.2 million in wages that ship owners simply hadn't paid. $45 million owed, found, and clawed back in a single year, on top of whatever never gets reported at all. And as we're about to see, this same arrangement, foreign flag, foreign incorporation, minimal tax obligation to the country whose citizens fund the business, cuts both ways. Because the same structure that shields a cruise line's profits during the good years offers it almost no support during the bad ones. In March 2020, when COVID-19 shut down global travel overnight, cruise lines went to Washington and asked for the same kind of financial support that airlines, hotels, and restaurants were receiving. They were turned down, not because of politics, because of paperwork. The same flags of convenience that had shielded their profits for decades disqualified them from U.S. federal relief, because on paper, they weren't U.S. companies. The system built to minimize what they owed the United States also minimized what the United States owed them back. Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian survived that gap anyway by raising tens of billions of dollars in emergency debt and equity from private capital markets instead. Genting Hong Kong did not have that same access. Its balance sheet was already strained before the pandemic even started, and its shipbuilding arm in Germany, MV Werften, was burning cash on unfinished vessels that had no paying customers. COVID didn't create the weakness. It just removed the 2 years of runway that might have let Genting Hong Kong outrun it. That's the trait at the center of this entire business. And nowhere did it play out more dramatically than with a company most vacationers had never heard of, one flag registry away from the brands they had. Genting Hong Kong was, at its peak, Asia's largest cruise operator, owner of Star Cruises, Dream Cruises, and the luxury line Crystal Cruises, once considered the most awarded name in high-end cruising anywhere in the world. The trouble didn't start on a ship. It started at a shipyard. Genting Hong Kong's German shipbuilding subsidiary, MV Werften, collapsed into bankruptcy in early January 2022, leaving the parent company holding roughly $2.78 billion in debt it could not refinance. On January 18, 2022, Crystal Cruises suspended all voyages immediately. More than 20,000 booked passengers and around 1,200 crew members were affected in a single announcement. The company website went dark. Customer service lines simply stopped answering. The next day, January 19th, Genting Hong Kong filed a winding-up petition in a court in Bermuda, the same jurisdiction, worth noting, that had made its corporate structure so tax-efficient for years, asking for provisional liquidators to take control before what the company itself called a disorderly liquidation. And then it got stranger, because 3 Crystal ships were still at sea, mid-voyage, with paying passengers on board, when the company that owned them ran out of cash. The Crystal Symphony was sailing toward Miami, expected to dock on schedule, when a U.S. federal judge, acting on a lawsuit over $4.6 million in unpaid fuel bills, issued an order to seize the ship the moment it arrived in port. So the ship didn't go to Miami. It diverted, mid-voyage, to Bimini in the Bahamas, a jurisdiction that would not enforce the American arrest warrant. 300 passengers found out they weren't going home on schedule because their ship was, in effect, running from a debt collector with the legal authority of a U.S. federal court behind him. One passenger described it, without much exaggeration, as being abducted by luxurious pirates. The crew fared far worse than the passengers. Left without pay, without healthcare coverage, and without repatriation flights home, some Crystal crew members remained stranded, unpaid, for well over a year while the liquidation dragged through courts in Hong Kong and Bermuda. The crew of the Crystal Symphony alone spent more than 18 months navigating the fallout before their situation was resolved. 18 months. That's not a delay. That's a year and a half of a person's working life, absorbed entirely by a corporate structure they had no legal standing to challenge, because their employment contracts were governed by flag state law in a jurisdiction thousands of miles from home, arbitrated, if at all, by processes the shipowner controlled. The financial toll on everyone else was just as severe. Bloomberg later reported that Crystal Cruises had gone from an estimated $1 billion valuation to an empty bank account within weeks, leaving travelers, travel agents, employees, and vendors collectively out more than $100 million in unrefunded deposits, unpaid commissions, and unpaid invoices. Zero. That's what was left in the account of a company that, months earlier, agents were still being told was financially stable enough to keep booking future cruises into 2024. By May 2023, Genting Hong Kong was formally delisted from the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. Its liquidators told the exchange plainly that the company had no plan to resume operations and no path back to compliance. The Crystal brand itself was eventually revived under new ownership in 2023, but only after ships were auctioned off. The original fleet plan was gutted, and the most awarded luxury cruise line of just a year earlier had effectively ceased to exist as the company its passengers thought they'd booked with. The lesson here isn't that cruise companies are uniquely reckless. It's that the exact structure built to minimize tax exposure during boom years, foreign incorporation, foreign flags, minimal jurisdictional accountability, is the same structure that leaves almost nobody with legal standing when the boom ends. Not the crew, not the passengers, not even, in the end, the shareholders. Genting Hong Kong is not an isolated case study, either. It's just the most visible one. Smaller cruise and ferry operators sail in and out of insolvency under flags of convenience regularly, almost never making international headlines, because their passengers number in the hundreds rather than the tens of thousands, and their crews come from countries with even less diplomatic leverage than the Philippines or Indonesia. Genting Hong Kong became a story precisely because a U.S. federal judge tried to enforce a $4.6 million debt against a ship full of American retirees. Most flag of convenience failures never get a court order dramatic enough to make the news. So who actually wins in this system? Not the crew member working a 72-hour week under a flag they've never heard of, with a wage that would be illegal onshore in the country selling the ticket above their head. Not, in the end, always the shareholder either. Ask anyone still owed money from Genting Hong Kong's liquidation. The winner is whoever controls the structure itself, the flag registry that collects an annual fee for asking no questions, and the parent corporation that gets to choose, freely and legally, which country's laws will govern its labor force, its tax bill, and its liability the day something goes wrong. While a hotel chain on land is bound to the labor law, tax code, and court system of wherever it physically operates, a cruise line gets to shop for all three, and it shops for the lowest bidder every time, because nothing in international maritime law stops it from doing exactly that. This is the same pattern that shows up across every asset-light empire we've covered on this channel. The party that owns the brand, sets the terms, and can walk away from any single jurisdiction without losing the whole business always outlasts the party that's tied to one ship, one payroll, one location. Hilton owns barely 3% of the hotels wearing its name. Somewhere underneath every McDonald's arch is a franchisee carrying the real estate risk. And underneath every cruise ship's gleaming hull is a flag registry that assumes almost none of the risk while collecting a fee on almost all of the revenue. And the industry keeps growing regardless. A record 37.2 million people took an ocean cruise in 2025, up from 34.6 million the year before, and up from 31.7 million the year before that. CLIA, the industry's own trade association, projects the global fleet will keep expanding through 2028, with dozens more ships already on order. None of that growth requires the flag of convenience system to change even slightly. If anything, it depends on it staying exactly the way it is. The passenger sees a ship. The worker sees a jurisdiction they didn't choose. And the company sees an asset that can be reflagged, reincorporated, or reorganized across a border the moment the numbers stop working in its favor. That is the actual product being sold here. Not the swimming pool. Not the buffet. The legal ability to operate a floating economy that answers to almost no single government. While every government whose citizens are on board, or working below deck, watches the tax revenue and the labor protection sail past their jurisdiction, one flag at a time. Go back to that flag on the stern of the ship. It's not decoration. It's the entire business model, condensed into one small piece of fabric, a legal signal that says, this vessel belongs to whichever country asked the fewest questions and charged the lowest fee, regardless of where its money, its passengers, or its workers actually come from. For 37 million people who cruised in 2025, a record for the industry, that flag is invisible. It flies behind the pool deck, behind the buffet, behind the nightly show, and almost nobody looks up. For the roughly 1.8 million people worldwide whose paychecks depend on this industry, that same flag is the only law that governs how many hours they work, how much they're paid, and what happens to them if the company above them runs out of cash at sea. There's still plenty of room left for this system to grow, which is exactly why nobody inside the industry is volunteering to change it. Even after a record 2025, cruise penetration in North America, the industry's largest market, sat at just 6.01% of the population in 2024. In Europe, it was 1.72%. In Asia-Pacific, a region CLI has spent a decade courting, it was 0.09%. 99.9% of the Asia-Pacific population has never taken an ocean cruise. From where the three conglomerates sit, that's not a mature industry running out of runway. It's a business model with most of its addressable market still untouched, built on a tax and labor structure that has survived, largely unchanged, for nearly a century. So the question isn't whether the flag of convenience is legal. It clearly is, a 99-year-old provision of tax code, used exactly as written. The question is this: when you book a cabin on a floating hotel that answers to almost no government on Earth, are you getting a bargain? Or are you the reason the bargain exists in the first place? And if the company that sold you that ticket can vanish from a flag, a jurisdiction, and a balance sheet in a matter of weeks, how sure are you that anyone is actually in charge of the ship you're standing on?